Hey, what's up everyone? My name is Nicholas Corcel, and today we're going to be talking about 2666 again. In this video, we're going to be focusing on the second part, or the second book of the novel, referred to as the part about Amalfitano. And my initial impressions upon reading this, in comparison to part one, is that it's a lot less linear and the narrative structure is a lot less traditional than what we saw in that first chapter. And by that, I just mean that in the first book, thing one happens, then thing two, then thing three, four, five, six. And so we meet those four professors, and then they go through the world. They're obsessed with this writer called Amalfitano, and they have dedicated their lives to him, searching for answers, searching for him physically as well. And they end up in this city of Santa Teresa in northern Mexico, which we discussed, we know is the very real Ciudad Juárez, which is completely overrun with femicides. And in that part, we see the core idea of the novel, which is this horror, the femicides, the decay of the world. We see that operating on the periphery of the narrative. And in this part, the part about Amalfitano, that horror becomes centralized, or even internalized rather. And we see that horror coming through the brain of Amalfitano. And Amalfitano is the professor that they meet in the first book. And so the horror begins. Think about it like you have a house, a yard, and a fence. In the first part of the first book, the decay of modern world, modern civilizations, is operating on the outside of the fence. In this part, it doesn't come into the yard, but rather into the house. It's in Amalfitano's brain. And through this internalization, we see the madness of Santa Teresa, the madness of the modern world begin to permeate and really take over the narrative. The first introduction we have to this is Amalfitano's wife, Lola, who leaves him in Mexico to go back to Spain to go find this poet that she says she used to hook up with. But we also hear that the poet is gay and has been gay, and he lives in an insane asylum. And Lola just kind of travels through Europe. She sleeps with different people to get money needed to continue hitchhiking. She ends up going to the insane asylum. It's unclear whether she ever actually meets the guy, or if when she does meet him, if he remembers her, because she's a very unreliable narrative. But eventually, she ends up in Paris and works as a cleaner and has another child. So we see her kind of descent into madness, very akin to Edwin John's in the first book, where she is searching for something. Edwin John is searching for that artistic fame or credibility, which leads to him mutilating himself and cutting off his hand. She's searching for something as well. She's searching for this poet that she believes to have had this incredibly intimate connection with. This poet, his work is, that's the reason why she lives in many ways. And in some ways, you could even link that to the professors, how they're obsessed with Archibald in the first book. And I think it's a layered conversation that you can have, because when a professor is obsessed with a writer, that relationship is considered okay. There's even social and cultural capital that they gain from that. Nobody criticizes a mathematician that is obsessed with some theory or some other mathematician. But if you have a normal person who is obsessed with a writer or somebody like that, then they are viewed as kind of crazy. And Lola would be societally looked down upon for leaving her family and prostituting herself out in many ways to come chase this poet. But the professors, they abandon everything that they know to go to Mexico, to go to one of the most dangerous parts of Mexico, to track down this writer that doesn't want to be seen. They're stalking this man, and that would not be really considered taboo. Further, those professors have basically given up any chance of having a family in pursuit of Archibald. And while it's a little different that Lola had a family and is giving it up to pursue the poet, it's also similar in many ways. So I thought that was kind of interesting to track her perceived madness and then compare it to the professors. Another example of this slow decaying of the European veneer that kind of protects people from the decay and some of the horrors of the world we see through Rosa, which is Amalfitano and Lola's daughter. She leaves the safety of Europe, or at least the perceived safety of a European city like Barcelona, and moves to Santa Teresa with its ongoing femicides. And so this is another example of she is physically moving from safety to danger, and that's working into Amalfitano's mind, and this madness is starting to go on. And madness has begun to be characterized as almost a disease, with Bolaño directly saying that madness is contagious, thought Amalfitano. And it's just permeating through his brain, and we see three different manifestations of this, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in the video. But that's something that I really think that you'll get a lot out of if you think about while you're reading this part. And another quick aside, when reading a book like this, especially this book, I have found it very helpful to read resources and watch reviews before I read the actual part, just because while of course you do get a little bit of spoilers, you can't really spoil a book like this. And watching the reviews, especially if it's a good review, and I've been watching a lot of Leaf by Leaf's reviews of this, you know what to look for. So it's a lot easier to navigate when you have at least a basic map, a basic understanding of what you want to be looking for. So that's something I very, very highly recommend. And I'll put his link. I'll put a link to his video in the description. Before we wrap up today's video, which is going to be a little bit shorter than the first part, just because a lot less happened in this than the first one, I want to really talk about Amalfitano's descent into madness. Specifically, as I mentioned earlier, the three ways that we see that manifested. The first and perhaps most obvious way of this descent into madness being characterized is through the very odd geometry book that he takes and hangs up on the clothesline outside. And you might not remember, which I certainly didn't until I read about it online, we actually see this geometry book mentioned in the first part when the professors come to Amalfitano's house. They see it and they wonder, what is going on here? But the significance of this book, I think, is huge, because Amalfitano is not a mathematician. He's not a math professor. No, he's a philosophy professor. And he finds this book in his house, right? And he doesn't remember buying this book, but it's there. And it's a geometry book. And what does geometry do? Geometry attempts to prescribe and assign meaning, order, and logic to something that is inherently none of those things, something that is inherently chaotic. And so by taking that book and seeing a book that is about the ordering of chaos, just as he's beginning to experience that internal chaos that is him descending into madness, is super interesting. But then it's taken one step further, where he takes that book and now adds a level of materialism to it, where he takes it outside and he hangs it up on the clothesline. And so we see the world, the environment of Santa Teresa. We see that physically attacking order, right? The book is order. The elements, the rain, the wind of Santa Teresa is attacking order. Just like the femicides are attacking humanity within the confines of Santa Teresa. And so we see this working on a lot of levels. And I find that to be deeply, deeply fascinating, because when you initially read this book, it sounds just weird. Why would he have a geometry book? What is the point of any of that? But the more you think about the symbolism, and the more you think about why Bolaño did that, it layers the book. And honestly, that's probably one of the best things that I saw included in the book. So that's something I really challenge you to do with Bolaño, is if you see something that you're like, this is weird, or even this is stupid, really try to dig deeper and think about why he might have included it. Because every time I've thought that something is stupid, upon further interrogation, I realized that it's some of the best and most meaningful symbolism in the whole book. Secondly, in relation to the geometry book, we see Amalfitano making a lot of these automatic drawings, where he's drawing a shape and writing a bunch of random people's names on it: creatives, artists, writers, philosophers, these types of people, even book critics. We see the Blooms mentioned as well. And again, this is just in a similar vein to the geometry, so I won't go too long about this one. This is just him trying to put order into his thoughts. This is trying to get him to calm his overworked brain down. His brain is going crazy. His brain is descending into madness, but he doesn't know how to control it. He doesn't know how to stop it. And another example of not example rather, but a possible trigger of this madness that we see pretty early on in the book, or pretty on in this part rather, is when Rosa wants to go out to the movies. She wants to go out to the movies at night, and he talks about how other girls have gotten attacked coming out of that movie theater in that area of town. And these things are all weighing at him. He's moved his family from Barcelona, as I mentioned earlier, to this city, and we don't know why. We don't know the salary package, obviously, but I would imagine that he'd make more as a university professor at a really prestigious university in Barcelona than he would in Santa Teresa. So we don't know why he's doing it. He doesn't seem to have a big affinity for Mexican culture. There's no real reason philosophically, which is his field, for him to be there, yet he's there. And so I think we see all this weighing at his mind. With the seeds of madness were planted, obviously, in Barcelona, but they're coming to fruition now. And Lola leaving, Rosa possibly becoming a victim. She wasn't in this part, but she very well could be. And that, of course, is weighing on his mind. These are all putting his descent into overdrive. You know, maybe in Barcelona it might have taken him 20 years to fully descend, but here in Santa Teresa it's happening, you know, in what appears to be a span of days, if not hours. And then finally, the third thing that we see him descending into madness is just the voice that he hears in his head. You know, he hears a voice talking, and the voice says some crazy things about his father, about his life in Chile, about homosexuality, and so that's kind of an interesting layer. His wife left him to go find a poet who is rumored to be homosexual, and then his voice starts saying really negative things about homosexuals. So is that maybe his brain manifesting negative thoughts towards his wife leaving? Can he not handle that? Like, 'cause he seems like he's adjusted pretty well to it and done well, even when she comes back to see Rosa again, because Lola is dying because she's contracted HIV. We don't know how, but we can obviously assume he is accepting of her. You know, he's nice to her, he's kind, but then this voice is saying wildly homophobic things, and she left him for a man who is openly homosexual. So that was interesting to think about, and also just, you know, classic. It's just kind of a classic storytelling mechanism of somebody's going crazy, somebody is becoming mad, put a voice in their head that begins telling them to do things, or begins telling them how to think and ordering their thoughts. And so with the geometry book and the automatic drawings, we had, you know, like things that we accept as ways to order your thoughts, and now we've introduced this voice, which is another way of ordering thoughts. Perhaps if those were good ways, good quote-unquote ways to order your thoughts, then this would be a bad way, just as we see European sensibilities placed against Santa Teresa and femicides. And so we're seeing these contrasts, and I've noticed that Bolaño is really enjoying working in these dichotomies of two, where it's got good versus evil in some ways. I think that's very overly simplistic, but it also works at a deeper level where we've got, you know, safety versus unsafety, and then the gray area in between, you know. So he creates these poles, but we don't really live in the poles. We introduce this one, we introduce the left, we introduce the right, so that we could live in the middle. And I think that that's what a lot of 2666 is doing at this point, and I'm loving every part of it. I will admit that the second part didn't grab me as hard as the first part, but I think that's just because it's a tougher read. And it certainly wasn't bad. I would not say that at all. And it kept me wanting to keep reading. It just left me very, very confused. I remember I finished reading this and I was like, I have no idea what I just read. So if you feel that, don't feel alone. I think that that's pretty common, if not intentional. But keep with it, because I think that this will be worth it in the end. And yes, I will be back shortly to talk about part 3, the part about fate. I'll see you then.